Hello friends, welcome to another day of Q&As, joined by my lovely and helpful wife Lucie.
Hi guys.
Lucie will be asking me one of your questions from Instagram.
Alright, next question is by Pastor Will. Hi Leo, I have noticed that agmatine supplementation has become more popular in the nootropics community recently. Its antagonism of NMDA is speculated to treat excess excitotoxicity, and some even claim it has mood-enhancing properties similar to ketamine. My question is whether you have ever supplemented with agmatine and whether you consider it something people should try. Personally, I have reservation about NMDA antagonists because I have SNPs correlated with schizophrenia.
Thank you, Lucie. Yeah, okay. So, thank you for the question, Pastor Will. I love this question. To be honest, I'm not going to do the subject justice today. I will try to discuss it at length, but I'm not going to do the subject justice. Now, to be honest with you, I've actually been planning to write an extensive blog series about the subject of blocking the NMDA receptors, which is NMDA. That's what you're reading. I'll explain what they are in a second. But I've been planning to write a series, like an exhaustive series on this subject for the purpose of people who want to enhance their cognition, because it is one of the subjects that people who are interested in enhancing cognition are most interested in. Few people understand it, and it's a complicated subject. But to be honest, I haven't really had much time lately. Probably I could have had time had I not fasted for so long. But anyway, and now I'm quite busy. But I will at some point write a series on this subject. So, and then I'll probably just make a dedicated video that's comprehensive covering the series. But today, we'll talk about it in a light way, and we'll talk about it around this question. First of all, we have to identify something. So he's talking about something called agmatine, okay? And agmatine is it's a natural substance that's produced in our brains under either hypoxic conditions, which means we have low oxygen, or under extreme cold, okay? It's produced naturally in the brain, and it has some effects in the body. You can supplement with it. It probably crosses the blood-brain barrier very well, and it will have those effects also then in a more concentrated fashion. Now, the main effect about agmatine that he's talking about is a blocking of a group of receptors in the brain called the NMDA receptors. They're named after, okay, before I get into that, one of the neurotransmitters in our brains that is most involved with something called long-term potentiation, which means basically learning in the brain, is called glutamate. Glutamate affects 4 groups of receptors. You can broadly categorize them as metabotropic or ionotropic. The metabotropic receptors are simply called the metabotropic receptors, and there are groups of them. Usually people are not so concerned with manipulating those. There's another group called the ionotropic receptors. Within those, they are named, just like many of the other receptors in our brains are, I've mentioned this before, by chemicals, synthetic chemicals that agonize those receptors. So there's the kainate receptors, there's the NMDA receptors, there's the AMPA receptors. Now, the ones that seem to cause us a lot of issues are the NMDA receptors, which is what this compound, Memantine, whatever it's called, is affecting. The NMDA receptors, so basically, you guys will recall that I've mentioned before there's something called excitotoxicity. I forgot who coined the phrase, but it wasn't coined that long ago. What it means is that some receptors that are excitatory, that cause more synaptic transmission, like dopamine and glutamate, can cause an overexcitement at a neuron, which if the neuron doesn't downregulate its receptors quick enough, it will die. And this is called excitotoxicity. This happens with dopamine. So this is how, for example, some dopaminergic drugs can cause death of certain, like MDMA, for example, the party drug, ecstasy or Molly or whatever it's called, can cause neuronal death. But also, by the way, many people don't know that MDMA as well as amphetamine also cause glutamate to rise. And glutamate can also cause the death of neurons. Okay, so I hope everyone's with me so far. So basically, one of the main ways that glutamate causes the death of neurons is through these NMDA receptors. So people have long been interested in this idea of, can we reduce glutamate's function at the NMDA receptors to protect ourselves from neuronal death? So that's the interesting element here. Now, there are two drugs that are well known for their effects on the NMDA receptors. They're called PCP, which I forgot what its name is, phenyl something, and ketamine. PCP is, I think, about 10 times stronger at blocking the NMDA receptors than ketamine. The NMDA receptors within their channel have a site. They have two sites. One is related to a synthetic called the MK801, I think, something like that. I can't remember exactly. And the other one is the PCP site.
I see.
Ketamine works at the PCP site and PCP works at the PCP site. So these are non-competitive antagonists of the NMDA receptors. So, and PCP is, as I said, something around 10 times more, has stronger affinity at blocking the receptor. So PCP basically really blocks the receptor very strongly. Ketamine blocks it a little bit less strongly. Then there are other drugs that also block it. So for example, there's a drug given to both people with Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease called Memantine. Memantine is a drug you can easily find online and buy yourself also. Memantine also has another drug very similar to it called amantadine, as opposed to amantine, whatever this one is. This one, sorry, these names are very similar. Agmatine. This one's called amantadine.
Okay.
Amantadine and memantine are very similar.
Mm-hmm.
They both have a similar affinity for the sigma-1 receptor, which is also a receptor that my favorite SSRI fluvoxamine affects. We don't really understand what this receptor does. Ibogaine also affects that receptor. But they have a similar affinity there. Actually, amantadine has a stronger affinity.
Mm-hmm.
But memantine has a much stronger affinity for the MK801, I think, binding site inside the NMDA receptor. Not as strong as ketamine.
Okay.
So, if I recall correctly, memantine has approximately 0.5 micrometer Ki at this site. 0.5. We'll just keep that in mind. Huperzine A, which is a supplement you can buy online, has a Ki in micrometers of 6.
Okay.
So it's 12 times lower affinity for that binding site. Now this may seem a little bit too detailed, but I'll tell you what the usefulness of this all is. Just to stay with me. So huperzine is about 6. Agmatine, this natural thing, I don't know what the micrometer affinity it has exactly is, but I assume it can't be that strong. But I don't really know, to be honest with you. Now, some other drugs that also block the NMDA receptor include tianeptine, which is a drug that was mentioned in the Boston Lloyd interview, the first one. I, at the time, didn't remember what it was, but I had looked into it before. And it's also a drug some people use. It's in some nootropics community, some nootropics websites, and some people use it for fun. Now, I'll explain why in a little bit. Hopefully I remember, but it's very interesting. But that drug blocks the NMDA receptor, but not at that PCP or MK801, whatever it is, binding site inside the receptor, inside the channel, but rather outside the channel at the glycine binding site. So glycine, it blocks the glycine bind. Right. So glycine and D-serine both allosterically modulate the NMDAR or the NMDA receptor. That means that they increase the receptor's opening to its natural agonist, which is glutamate.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't actually agonize it, but they increase its availability, exactly like benzodiazepines do to their receptors, which is the GABA receptors, GABA A receptors. Now, by the way, guys, coincidentally, since I mentioned it, GABA in the brain is made from glutamate. So, so the amount that you convert glutamate into GABA affects somewhat like what temperament you have. If you have a lot of glutamate and a little bit of GABA, like someone's genes I just analyzed recently, a couple of days ago, I was shocked. He has so much glutamatergic activity. You'll be more on edge than somebody that has more conversion to GABA and less glutamate receptor function.
Interesting.
So, and when you talk about on edge, we're really talking about this NMDA receptors a lot of the time. Those are the focus. So before I get more into agmatine and about the different ones, let me just say, why would we want to block this? This is what seems to happen. In Alzheimer's disease, as well as in Parkinson's disease, it's believed that what happens is So you want the NMDA, you want long-term potentiation. You want to be able to learn. And you cannot learn if you're blocking this thing all the time. But you don't want this channel to have a low-level, so-called noise, glutamate, opening it and communicating constantly. You don't want it all the time to be open and receiving glutamate. You want signal, not noise. It is thought that the noise element causes a slow degradation of neurons in the brain. And it is thought that in Alzheimer's disease and in Parkinson's disease, there's this low-level glutamate constantly communicating into the NMDA receptors. So, blocking these receptors, but not too strongly, blocking you with something that doesn't have a very high affinity, should allow you, because if it doesn't have a very high affinity, like for example, huperzine, which doesn't have a very high affinity, it means that it will block it quickly, but it can be removed quickly. So if glutamate comes in a significant amount, it'll be removed. And then also, it will close up quickly because you have to have a high amount of the substance in your brain for it to be able to antagonize it, because it has less affinity. Whereas PCP, you don't need much in the brain, it'll block it.
I see.
But because you need a higher amount, because of the laws of physics, it'll block it quicker because there's more mass. So this is an interesting concept. I found this in one paper. It was very interesting. I'll try to link it here so you guys can check it out. It's a really good paper. But basically the idea is that, because I've been looking into this for a long time personally, because I always think of ways that I can limit neuronal degradation in my brain, as well as ways I can enhance performance. And something I haven't mentioned so far, but blocking the NMDA receptors produces an anxiolytic effect. Which should be obvious to you guys. Glutamate is excitatory, GABA is inhibitory. This is not... also, blocking the NMDA receptors may somehow downstream cause enhanced GABAergic signaling. Not in a way, though, that seems to be unhealthy. For example, agmatine seems to do this with GABA, but seems to do it via...
That's why people feel mood enhanced.
No, that's the interesting thing. It may be, but there's an interesting... so let's bring that up here. So this is great. I like this kind of thing. If you guys ask me more questions like this, I have a lot of fun. So this is the interesting thing about it. A lot of the drugs that... Oh, by the way, before I say that, one other drug that does this, dextromethadone. If you guys recall from my methadone video, there's levomethadone and dextromethadone, two symmetric opposites of the molecule. Dextromethadone also blocks the NMDA receptors. Now, back to the point. So what is this mood-enhancing element they're getting? A lot of the molecules, this is so interesting, a lot of the molecules that block the NMDA receptors in one way or another also do one of two things. They either agonize the mu-opioid receptor, or they somehow cause agonism of it, or they block nicotinic cholinergic receptors, or inhibit, actually there's a third thing, or inhibit acetylcholinesterase.
Okay.
So 3 different things. Let's go one by one. The opioid effect. Ketamine. Now ketamine, as of 2019, is a drug FDA approved for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression. It's approved in a nasal formula. You inhale it through your nose, ketamine, and you have an immediate effect of mood enhancement. Now, there's a paper I found, which I should link here, which clearly posits the obvious problem with this, which is that if you use an opiate receptor blocker, like a mu-opioid receptor blocker, the mood-enhancing effect of ketamine goes away. Now, it's not clear if ketamine agonizes the mu-opioid receptor, which is the same receptor that heroin agonizes. It's not clear if it agonizes it directly itself, or if it causes a downstream upregulation of what are called endorphins, which are natural opioids in our body, that then agonize the mu-opioid receptor. However, what is clear is that although the NMDA receptor blocking aspect is anxiolytic, it reduces anxiety, this mu-opioid thing is enhancing the mood. And when you block that, the mood is not enhanced. So it's a big question is this, by the drug that's approved is called S-ketamine, with an E before it. It's a nasal. So is ketamine, when it enhances people's depression short term, is it doing it through the NMDA receptor or is it doing it through the opioid receptor? And nobody even knows if it's doing it directly or not. Now, another drug that does that, tianeptine, the one I mentioned that you can find on nootropics, probably nootropics Depot has it, All these other websites have it. The question is, does tianeptine, which by the way has a lot of studies showing it's mood enhancing and all that, is it doing that just through its allosteric modulation through the glycine site of the NMDA receptors, or is it because it is also agonizing the mu-opioid receptors, which it is?
Okay.
So actually, I have one client who books consults sometimes, who will remain nameless, of course, who is unfortunately not through. I mean, probably. I don't even think he. I think he. Actually, I never asked him, but I don't know if he became addicted to tianeptine by accident or he knew. But he's strongly addicted to tianeptine in an opiate fashion. But people don't warn people about this. So a lot of people think it's just a free ride. You just get a mood enhancing. So a lot of the drugs that block the NMDA receptors also agonize the mu-opioid receptor, which is the same receptor that heroin agonizes, morphine agonizes. What's that really potent one? I forgot what it's called that they put in. Anyway, whatever, that white powder that everyone's dying from in the East Coast. They all agonize the mu-opioid receptor, which these things also agonize. Now, the other interesting thing is some of these molecules also block nicotinic cholinergic receptors, which is something obviously I would never want to happen.
Yeah.
Because the nicotinic cholinergic receptors are some of the only receptors in the brain that are associated with learning and memory and that upregulate in response to agonism. So, if you take snus, which I have some here, but anyway, I won't show the camera. If you take snus, you not only improve your memory and cognition, but they don't downregulate in response to it. Now, of course, a large amount of nicotine, it's a U-shaped curve. So if you take a larger amount, you get less benefit. And if you take a lower amount, you get less benefit. There's a happy medium. But, and by the way, that seems to be true also for the NMDA receptors, which I should mention in a little bit. See, this is going to be disorganized because it's not my paper. But the point is, do I want to block the nicotinic cholinergic receptors? Absolutely not. And that's why I don't use Memantine. Memantine is the drug given to Alzheimer's disease patients. It has the 0.5 micrometer Ki for either the PCP or the MK site inside the ion channel. That drug blocks nicotinic cholinergic receptors very actively. Like the alpha-7 receptor is blocked. A couple of other receptors, I can't recall which ones are blocked quite effectively. So I don't want that. But it also, by the way, inhibits acetylcholinesterase, which is the enzyme that blocks, that breaks down acetylcholine in the brain. Acetylcholine is the natural agonist of nicotinic cholinergic receptors. So that's a good benefit. And by the way, the actual drugs given to Alzheimer's disease patients, because not all Alzheimer's disease patients are given Memantine, which is the NMDA. Its main function is for NMDA receptor antagonism. They're also given, the main drug that they're given usually is an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor, either donepezil or galantamine. Now galantamine actually, both of those drugs affect the NMDA receptor as well. Okay. But very slightly. So not as much as Memantine. Anyway, point is, so these, and also agmatine, the one that he mentioned, it blocks the nicotinic cholinergic receptors as well.
Also, they almost all do.
Well, huperzine A, we have no evidence that it does. Huperzine A, that's the one I use. And huperzine A is no joke. I mean, it's compared to amantadine, it's much more effective than amantadine, which is the sibling relative of memantine. It's 12 times less effective than memantine. But as I said earlier, we don't want something that's such a strong affinity to that to the MK or the PCP thing inside the, if it's allosteric modulation outside, that's one thing, at the glycine or serine receptor. But inside, you don't want it to be constantly pressed because, again, you want to stop that low-level glutamatergic activity, but you don't want to stop long-term potentiation. So you want something with a low enough affinity that you need a large mass, so it comes on and off quickly. You know what I mean? So now let's get into, before I get more into agmatine, which I can let's talk about agmatine. So these are the interesting elements about agmatine. Number one, it's an alpha adrenergic receptor agonist. Now that may be a good thing. So if you guys recall from my beta blocker video, a couple of beta blockers, the one that starts with CERV, and there's another one also, they also agonize the alpha adrenergic receptors. And this seems to produce the opposite effect of agonizing the beta receptors. So it may not be a bad thing. But, as I said, they block the nicotinic cholinergic receptors, which is something I don't want at all. But they have another effect, which could be good or bad, which is they inhibit nitric oxide synthase in the brain. Now, nitric oxide synthase it's the main enzyme involved with dilating blood vessels. So this could potentially cause someone to have what you'd call hypertension in their brain, which could cause the rupture of blood vessels in the brain or a stroke in the brain. But it also could reduce the amount of reactive nitrogen species you develop in your brain, which would cause.
Is those correlated?
First of all, agmatine is very little studied. Second of all, this would be completely theoretical. Nobody has ever experimented with reducing nitric oxide specifically in the brain. It's not something that people have experimented.
The outcome could be good or bad, but the bad seems to be worse than the good.
That's what I would think. That's why I won't use it myself, because I would be concerned that in the brain, these blood vessels would become tighter, and there could be hypertension in the brain, which is a really dangerous thing. So that's one thing, but you could experiment with it. I mean, it seems to have some good effects overall. Now, let's talk about the schizophrenia element, because he mentioned schizophrenia and he's very astute. This is an interesting concern. So basically, the main hypothesis of schizophrenia is a dopaminergic hypothesis, is that these people have high amounts of dopamine, but when you give, not schizophrenics, when you give animals a dopaminergic drug, they don't develop all of the symptoms of schizophrenia. They develop specifically the positive symptoms and not the negative symptoms. Specifically, they develop like mania, or no, not mania, but delusions of grandeur, things like that. What are we talking about specifically? We're talking about amphetamines.
Okay.
Now, when you give them PCP, this is where it all started. Basically, they noticed that people who are consuming PCP developed, in the short term, symptoms similar to schizophrenia.
Okay.
Specifically, they would see visual hallucinations, but they wouldn't hear auditory hallucinations. Whereas in actual schizophrenia, long-term schizophrenia, what would usually happen is that they hear slowly. First, they start hearing sounds. Then those sounds start to become very clear to them, and they become voices. And usually they don't see things, but some do. Some people do see things. I've met people who see hallucinations all the time. So, basically, this is where it comes from. Also, people notice in post-mortem analysis of schizophrenics that they had lower availability of the NMDA receptors and lower also glutamate activity in their cerebrospinal fluid and in their brain. And then again, if in ketamine, both in rodents, chronic use of ketamine seems to produce schizophrenic-like symptoms. In humans, acute use seems to produce schizophrenic-like symptoms. So they've developed this theory that maybe schizophrenics not only have high dopamine, but also have low glutamate activity, or specifically NMDA receptors that are underexpressed. But what's not known is the NMDA receptor and the glutamate underactive as a response to schizophrenia, or is it the cause? Nobody knows. And again, it doesn't produce all the symptoms. It produces mainly the negative symptoms, not the positive symptoms. These are classifications of schizophrenia.
SNPs that you can check to figure out.
So this is the other thing he mentioned, which is he said he has SNPs associated with schizophrenia. I have never analyzed anyone's cognitive genes that does not have SNPs associated with schizophrenia. People have different kinds, different amounts. Some of them are in the dopaminergic section. Some of them are in the glutamatergic section. Some of them are in the GABAergic section. There are many SNPs associated with schizophrenia. I have them. She has them. Every person I've ever encountered has them. So put that into perspective for yourself. You've not seen enough of these analyses to make a real judgment. Do I have more than usual or less than usual? Second of all, as I always mention to my clients, there's a reason why schizophrenia still exists in humanity. It's because when it doesn't become pathological, it causes greatness. So families, this has been known long before the genomes were analyzed in the early 2000s. It's long been noticed that families that have schizophrenics in them tend to be more creative and artistic. And families that have bipolar disease in them tend to be more productive. It's just in the pathological state that it's a problem. And the current state of the science is that about 50% of the likelihood of someone becoming a true schizophrenic, because there's, by the way, varieties of schizophrenics also. There's it's not just one kind. There's schizotypal personality, stuff like that. But the likelihood of someone becoming a full-out schizophrenic is about 50% determined probably by their genes and 50% by their environment and life stressors. So a lot of people go through life and they never had schizophrenic symptoms. Maybe they had low GABAergic signaling naturally, high glutamatergic signaling, or high dopamine or whatever. But then they went and consumed marijuana for a while, or they went on a couple of mushroom trips, and then they start getting auditory hallucinations and stuff like that. Personally, living in Los Angeles for a long time now, I think it's been a long time. I used to live in downtown LA for a number of years, very close to a place called Skid Row. Now, of course, many cities in the US have something called Skid Row. No city has anything compared to LA. Skid Row, she lived there with me for a while. Skid Row is in LA, it has, thousands and thousands and thousands of people living on the streets. By the way, it's pretty funny because it's right in front of a police station. Is the main part of it. But anyway, as I am a curious person, I've walked through there many times with my dog, and I talked to people. I've even sat with them, the drug addicts, and interviewed them about their lives. I was once thinking of writing a book on the subject. And what I've discovered is that many of them are schizophrenics. They have auditory hallucinations, and some even have visual hallucinations. And many of them developed it from the use of methamphetamine, from smoking methamphetamine. Now, I haven't met that many people who developed it from mushrooms or from marijuana. I actually have a friend or two that did. But in LA, I've met tons of people that developed it from methamphetamine. Methamphetamine increases both dopamine in the brain and glutamate. Now, by the way, something I haven't mentioned so far, ketamine also increases dopamine in the brain. But it also increases the degradation of dopamine. So it increases the recycling of dopamine in the brain. So that's another thing, by the way. When ketamine makes people happy, it might not even just be the opioid effect, but it's also this dopamine effect. So this is a really complicated discussion. But what I'm trying to say about the schizophrenia element is, unless you're taking something like PCP or ketamine that are non-competitive antagonists of the NMDA receptor at very strong KIs, micrometers, you probably don't have something to worry about. So for example, if you're taking huperzine A, or if you're taking agmatine, which we don't know exactly how it works exactly, but if you're taking these things, you probably don't have anything to worry about. If you're taking something like ketamine, I'm not a doctor, by the way, this is not medical advice, but if you're taking something like ketamine or PCP, you are blocking also the normal signals of glutamate, which means you're inhibiting some of the learning in your brain. Long-term potentiation, which, by the way, in the caffeine video I should have mentioned, caffeine, the only downside to it has been shown to reduce long-term potentiation, even in transcranial magnetic stimulation studies. Now, I don't know, I always forget something to mention in the videos, but the point is, unless you're blocking it like that strong affinity where glutamate comes and it just can't work, what's more interesting is to have something like huperzine A, which opens and closes quickly, will block this low-level pathologic glutamate signaling. Now, it has been shown, by the way, there is a study that shows that Memantine in healthy people, not people with Alzheimer's disease, at a higher dose than normal. See, the dose they give to Alzheimer's disease patients is 20 milligrams a day, and they titrate it up, just like you titrate up a SSRI. You don't just start with a high dose, because then you get more side effects.
I see.
In that study, sorry guys, our camera shut off for a second. So there's a study that shows that, there's one study that shows that Memantine, which, remember guys, is that drug that you can probably get online that is given to Alzheimer's patients that has a quite strong affinity, 0.5 micrometer Ki to the NMDA receptors. There's one study that shows that in healthy people, not in Alzheimer's patients, that drug can reduce object recognition but not facial recognition in healthy volunteers. But there's one problem with that study. In Alzheimer's disease patients, just like with SSRIs, Memantine is titrated up from a low dose to a higher dose. And the highest dose they go to is 20 milligrams. That study took healthy volunteers who you would assume don't have like pathological low-level glutamate signaling, and just started them on 30 milligrams, which is 50% higher than the maximum dose of Alzheimer's disease. and they showed a slight lowering in object recognition. I don't take that study seriously. So what I think is that someone who's trying to protect their brain in the long term may want something that has a lower affinity than memantine, or even possibly memantine, but I don't take memantine. I take huperzine A. 12 times lower affinity than memantine. Also, huperzine A is an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor, so it increases the availability of acetylcholine in the brain. Mm-hmm. It's a nice thing. I experienced a good effect from it. Lucie can't take it. Lucie took it and she felt sleepy or too relaxed from it. But somebody who like me maybe has a little bit of higher stimulation. Also, for example, if somebody is taking a stimulant that increases glutamate in the brain, you don't want just a consistent increase in glutamate. You're probably not looking for that increase in glutamate. You're probably looking for an increase in dopamine. Mm-hmm. So it would be nice to have something that would reduce that a little bit. It might not reduce it that much. It depends on the strength of the signal. If the signal is very strong, huperzine won't reduce it, and memantine won't as well. But ketamine and PCP will. Now, one danger. So, glutamate causes excitotoxicity, right, when it's overstimulated. And low levels of glutamate seem to cause brain degradation. But PCP and ketamine are also considered neurotoxic. Why is this? This is why I was going to write a paper about the subject, because it's very interesting. Yeah. In rodents, they have been shown to create something called Olney's lesions. Olney's lesions happen when a very strong affinity antagonist at the PCP or MK site inside the ion channel of the NMDA receptor is used for an extended period of time. But these have not been replicated in ape studies or monkey studies. And it seems to be because the metabolism of the brains of rodents is far quicker than ours. So they may not even happen in humans. There is not concrete evidence that PCP or ketamine are neurotoxic. And PCP or ketamine are on a different scale than memantine, than huperzine, or than agmatine. So I'm personally not so concerned about this neurotoxic effect. By the way, tianeptine would most likely not do this, because tianeptine, as I said earlier, works outside the ion channel at the glycine site. It blocks the glycine site. By the way, guys, for those that don't know, glycine also basically allosterically modulates the ion channel of the NMDA receptor. So, which is interesting, because when you take glycine, I don't know if you guys have ever tried this, it's a good sleep aid. If you take glycine, you'll find that you get relaxed, which is weird because it actually positively modulates the NMDA receptor. So it should increase glutamate's activity there, but maybe it has some other effects. That would be an interesting blog post to do also. I should research glycine. Anyway, so this is the long discussion. Look, it may be hard to follow this discussion for people that are not that into cognitive enhancement yet, but I will write a blog post and make a separate video at some point in the next few months giving a comprehensive review of manipulating the glutamatergic system for the purposes of protecting your brain in the long term. But what's a takeaway from this is that agmatine may cause hypertension in the brain, but may reduce reactive nitrogen species, which are like reactive oxygen species. They are also, by the way, guys, for those that don't remember, reactive nitrogen species are what are found in tobacco. They're what are found in chewing tobacco, for example. Lesser amounts of them are in snus, which is what I consume. They're also in bacon. That's why bacon causes cancer from reactive nitrogen species, but also polyaromatic hydrocarbons if it's smoked, even if it's not smoked, when it's cooked. And so it could reduce the amount that your brain produces that. But it could also close down the blood vessels in the brain. It also has this adrenergic stimulation, which the other drugs here do not. It also blocks the nicotinic cholinergic receptors, which could be, it could reduce your cognitive ability. But and we don't know exactly how it blocks the NMDA receptors and with what micrometer Ki affinity. On the other hand, huperzine A, in my opinion, is a great option. And for those that are very motivated, you can find Memantine online very easily. And you can try that out yourself and see how it goes. Anyway, I hope this was helpful. Did you learn something from it? I think this is new for you too. Yeah. Okay, yeah. I never talked to her about this either. All right, guys. Thank you for your question. We'll see you next time.